Okay, I'd like to. Okay, so this morning, first session is session 3, Building Sector Decarbonization and Energy Systems Modeling. And this session is going to be chaired by Sean Morash from Telos Energy. Sean is very active in ESIG and is chairing one of the task forces in this area. It's got a great panel with some really good experts from the US and Europe. I'm very pleased to welcome them and welcome Sean here. And I will turn it over to Sean.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you to everybody else for being here. I know you could be in a lot of places. We're in San Diego. You could be surfing. So thank you for coming and listening to some talk about buildings. Like Charlie said, I'm chairing the building task force that ESIG has set up with funding from Department of Energy and Berkeley Lab. When I was doing the research for some background effort on it, I was talking to a number of building energy modelers, and one of them said, hey, when we write these big reports about building energy modeling, we always put at the end, we should really talk to some grid modelers about this. And I thought, man, I've never heard a grid modeler say, I need to talk to a buildings person. And so I want to do a quick show of hands. Has anybody in here ever talked to a building energy modeler? Are you a building energy modeler? I see like 3 hands raised. Okay, perfect. My intuition was correct. So apparently there's a lot we can learn from this session. I'm going to try to, in 3 slides, convince you why you should care. The first slide is more around demand management, around grid interactive buildings. We looked back at last year's California load events. Early September, it was really hot, and they had issued a couple of EEAs, EA2, EA3. If you kind of do the chart and think about when they sent a mass text to everybody and said, please, the quote is, turn off or reduce non-essential power if health allows, now until 9 p.m. You can see almost immediately the load drop, right? Folks stopped using power when they got asked politely. California's done a lot of work on trying to incentivize this behavior. I think we can all incentivize, think about different ways to incentivize this behavior. But really, we would have started shedding load. Instead, California kind of just asked politely. And so, is this really the grid interactive building that we want? Or do we want something a little more sophisticated, a little more nuanced, a little more controlled? So that's the first question, is basically demand management happens. It's real. We're in the midst of kind of I want to say a demand management reinvigoration because of a variety of new technologies, including electric vehicles, including kind of smart thermostats being ubiquitous. I'm more optimistic than I have been recently. The second chart of why you should care about buildings. There's some really interesting research out of Texas A&M where they created a couple of different models. One was using kind of load sensitivity to weather based on historical sensitivity factors, kind of that you can think of it like the correlation between weather and temperature. And then they used more recent weather correlation factors. And what they found was, hey, if load behaved closer to weather like it did in the early 2000s, it would have been the dotted line here. But we have increasing weather sensitivity of our load. And so we get a spikier behavior. We get higher peaks. And so this is a kind of increasingly, this stuff is going to show up. Increasingly, building loads are going to look a little different than they have historically. And then the third one, when we think about things in a kind of resource adequacy context, I lied. I said 3 charts. I guess it's 4 charts. When you think about things in a resource adequacy context, our winter events look different. They last longer. Our kind of sustained high load periods can be longer. And so we're talking about more energy adequacy, more energy deficits that we might run into. And we have to think about what that means for building safety, right? So there's this concept of thermal resilience where, hey, if I lose power, how long does my building stay at a comfortable temperature? And we can kind of see, hey, there's a role for energy efficiency here. There's a role for passive buildings here to make sure that folks, aren't exposed to extremely cold temperatures, even when the grid does fail. So the message I'm trying to send here is buildings matter. They're going to show up in a variety of different ways, even if we're not totally paying attention to them. We're going to have more work on this as the task force kind of matriculates as we develop a white paper. If you're interested in this, we've got a couple more meetings that I'm excited for. So without further ado, I'm going to try to hand it over to Lieve, and she's going to give us some more background on kind of more fundamentals of what we need to know about buildings. So.
Thanks, Sean. So the focus of this session is on the building sector. And I will start by stressing the importance and also the challenges, and then we'll look for a solution. Not only what is a solution, but also how can we reach the solution. And then for this, typically, we model some scenarios. And in Belgium, because I'm from Belgium, some examples are from Belgium, we typically end up with electrification and district heating as the solutions. But these, of course, impact the grids. And I say grids, not only the electricity grid, but also the thermal grid. And this creates then the need for demand flexibility and also a system integrator. And finally, I will put forward sector coupling as the solution. In Europe, heating has been the elephant in the room for too long. And I could say that today, cooling is becoming the elephant in the waiting room. But in the United States, cooling has been the elephant in the room already for a long time. And worldwide, we see that cooling is the top driver for electricity use because of two reasons. We have a sharp increase in the use of air conditioning, but also we have a huge cooling demand for AI, for cooling the data servers. So let's give some key numbers. In the final energy use, the share of heat is almost 50%. So this is much larger than electricity, which counts for about 22%. Regarding CO2 emissions, 40% of the annual global CO2 emissions are attributed to the building sector. So I think these two numbers show clearly that decarbonizing HVAC in buildings is really key. And the challenge is to create a comfortable and a healthy indoor climate in a carbon neutral society. So that's what we try to tackle as a challenge. What would then be the solution for the built environment? Should we just go for decarbonizing all supply of heat and cold and keep demand equal or even growing? Would that be a solution? Then we could go for the direct use of renewable or even residual energy sources. We could go for carbon-free or carbon-neutral fuels like hydrogen or bio-based fuels, and we could go for electrification. Now, a lot of questions pop up there because we have concerns about cost, about availability, about temperature levels, about materials, and so on. So in all cases, I think my opinion is that we need demand reduction as well. So efficiency remains key in this whole story. And that means that the solution is a balanced approach. So we should first reduce the demand where possible, and that has to do with efficient equipment, has to do with insulated buildings and so on. And then what remains should be decarbonized. And then the main question is, what's the optimal balance? How far should we go in reduction, and what should then still be decarbonized? And that's a very difficult question. As a recommendation, we can say, do not go too far with any specific measure to keep it cost effective. So don't exaggerate in whatever direction. Now, for those who still think that hydrogen is the holy grail, I show this picture from a very recent report of the IEA that stresses the important role of hydrogen, but it's a limited role. It's only up to 10% of the total energy use. And if you look at the buildings, it's a clear zero. So we're not going to focus further on hydrogen here. Now, to find that optimal balance, we typically model some scenarios. And I give you some results for an exercise we did in Belgium over all sectors, but I'll focus here on the building sector only. We looked in different scenarios, and as a result, I'll always look at the most right side. That's the result for 2050. We see whatever scenario we take here, we always come up with the same solution, being the combination of electrification and district heating. So that means we're going to install a lot of heat pumps, we're going to phase out fuel oil, and a substantial amount of buildings are going to be connected to district heating. If we look at CO2 emissions, of course, they are comparable because that was the target set. We wanted to go for zero carbon in 2050. But if we look then at the costs, they differ. There you see that there is one scenario being electrification, which has the lowest cost. And this scenario gives access to more offshore wind and the option to invest in new nuclear technology. So doing this gives us a lower cost. So I've shown electrification is key, but in the built environment, we combine this with efficiency, and then you could call it as well heat pumpification, right? So a heat pump, for those who would not know it, it's a simple thermodynamic cycle where we upgrade low quality heat at quite low temperature up to a temperature we can use, which is a higher quality heat. And for this, we use a little bit of electricity. That's to drive the compressor. It is the same technology as refrigerators, and they exist already for more than 200 years. So it's nothing new. In a heat pump, we always generate heat and cold simultaneously. On the one side, at the top side in the picture, you see the cooling, and on the other side, the bottom side of the picture, you see the heating. Now, what is then still advancing today? Well, we aim for higher performance, and that's expressed in the coefficient of performance, the COP, and we aim for alternative refrigerants that have a lower global warming potential, so are less harming for the environment and the climate. It is a carbon neutral technology if we use electricity that is based on renewable or residual energy sources, and it has a lower COP in a cold climate, but always it has a COP higher than 1, so you do always better than direct electrical heating. If you compare the different sources you can use, then water and ground have a more stable source temperature than air. And sizing, that's an important aspect. If you look, especially in retrofitting buildings, often heat pumps are oversized, and that means that they have a lot of on-off cycling, which is not good for the lifetime of the heat pump. Heat emitters and pipes on the other side are often undersized. So these are really points of attention if you renovate a building. But it is a viable solution in a lot of dwellings, also for renovation. So don't think a heat pump is only for newly built buildings. Just a picture for Europe. I don't know the numbers for the United States, I'm sorry for that. But in Europe, we see a very clear growth of the heat pumps installed, the number of heat pumps installed. We had a doubling in 4 years, and today we have about 20 million heat pumps installed. So Europe is seen as the fastest growing markets, but in North America, we have the most heat pumps already installed, and in China, we have the largest market. So all of us are winning, actually, if you look it from another side. Now, if you want to incentivize people to install a heat pump, then we have to look at the electricity gas price ratio, because this is an extremely important factor that will either motivate people to buy a heat pump or not. And this is a ratio, a factor that varies among countries, but also varies in time. Just an example here on the left side, you see the values for 2020. And if you look at at Belgium, which is a very tiny country on the center west, let's say, there we had a value of 5.4 in 2020. And in 2022, we had a value of 3.3. So you can see in 2 years, it can vary a lot because of all external factors happening. And you all know what I refer to. Now, this electricity gas price ratio has a huge influence on the financial feasibility of a heat pump, and especially in renovation. And I'll show you this by a very simplified picture here, where I plot the payback period, the simple payback period, as a function of the efficiency of the technology. So the COP, the seasonal COP of the heat pump. And then you see clearly that the higher the efficiency, the shorter will be the payback time. That's logic. But you see also a clear influence of the electricity gas price ratio, especially on the left side, there where we have the lower efficiency of the heat pump. And that's typically happening in renovation. And if you then remember the number I showed you in the previous slide, where Belgium had a ratio above 5, you can imagine that the payback period was huge and no one was motivated to buy a heat pump, only those who cared about environment and climate change. Now, not only the efficiency of the technology is important, also the efficiency of the building itself. And I try to explain shortly what I show here. So you see in these tables on the vertical axis, you see the insulation level before renovation. On the horizontal axis, you see the insulation level after renovation. And normally that's better. So that's the reason why the top part is black. Now, the numbers in the cells, they indicate the fraction of heat supplied by the heat pump. And if you look then at the bottom, there you see different of these tables for different values of the electricity gas price ratio. And if that value is high, then heat pump is financially not attractive at all. If it decreases, then depending on your insulation level of the building, then you go either for a heat pump, a hybrid system, or still go for a gas boiler. This ratio has to be below 2, such that heat pumps can be found everywhere. And this is a kind of very easy exercise we did to explain to the policymakers that is what will happen if you decrease the electricity gas price ratio. So please adapt your policy in that direction, because that will help the people to buy a heat pump and install a heat pump. Okay, these heat pumps, I already told you, they use electricity, so they have an impact on the grid, not only on the electricity grid, also on the thermal grids. And the impact has to do with their load profiles, and especially the peak loads are important there. And there you should not look at the load as something which is fixed. It's not a fixed input. It can be very flexible. You can take a lot of measures to change, to influence that load profile, like efficiency measures. You can shed or shift loads, you can modulate, and so on. So if you look at the bottom line, there you see a demand curve, the gray one, which is the original curve if you would not take any additional actions. If you take then an efficiency measures and you add also local generated PV and you do some shifting and shedding, then you end up with the blue curve. And this is much lower and much more flat than the original gray one. So you can really play with these demand profiles to make it interesting for the grid. So this means we need somehow demand flexibility. We need to get this in practice. So we are going to co-optimize to serve occupants on the one side, but also the grid on the other side. And for this, we need a system integrator. And the system I refer to consists then of the grid interactive, efficient smart buildings, the electricity system with a lot of variable renewable energy sources, the district heating networks, and the heat pumps. Now, from the demand side, I'm looking at the building sector. I assume for now that the electricity system is a given, and all the other three are flexible resources we can use to help the electricity system. And this creates a lot of gains. We can lower costs, we can enhance reliability resilience, we can reduce emissions, we can reduce peak loads, moderate damping, demand ramping, we can provide grid services, enhance energy efficiency, and integrate distributed and renewable energy sources. Grid-friendly buildings, well, the design of a building and the choice of the energy system in the building will determine how much flexibility you can offer. So these choices are important. You can already, by designing the building in the right way, you can offer more or less flexibility. Just some examples. If you go for a lightweight building with a very fast emission system, like an air-based system, the window to shift loads is very limited. If you go, on the other hand, for a very heavyweight building with also an emission system with a lot of inertia, then your window becomes much larger. And you offer flexibility because you have storage potential. Another thing I want to stress is that the combination of a heat pump and PV is often seen as a very good match. This might be the case here where you have cooling dominated buildings, but it's not at all the case in Belgium where we have heating dominated buildings, because there we have a temporal mismatch. And I show what I mean. And so you all know this challenge. You have a building, a house, a dwelling with PV on the roof and a heat pump to provide heating and or cooling. At noon, you have PV production, but you need the electricity later in the evening. So there is a temporal mismatch. So you can then add some source of flexibility, like a thermal energy storage tank, where you keep then that hot water, you store it till the evening when you need it. Okay, we did some calculations on this, and these are maybe not very clear pictures, but I explain what I want to show here. On the top plot, you see in gray, for each month of the year, you see the amount of PV electricity generated. The different dots relate to different surface area for PV. In black, you see the self-consumption in the building itself. So you see in summer months, you have a bit of curtailment because you produce more than you need. You could say, okay, let's go then for active cooling as well, then you have a bit better match, but still you see you have to size the PV carefully such that you do not have to curtail too much. Now that's not the main problem. The main problem is in the bottom plots. There you see in gray the amount of electricity you need, and in black again the self-consumption of PV production. And if you look then at the winter months, you see a very big gap. So you're not producing the electricity when you need it. This is for Belgium, where we have heating dominated buildings. So there is not at all a good match between PV production and heat pump consumption. So we should maybe not try to optimize this on the individual building level. We should maybe go to larger systems, and then I refer to clusters of buildings, to energy communities, where you can unlock an increased flexibility, which then increase efficiency synergy. And this can be done in multiple ways. You can, for example, combine buildings with a different function, and they can then easily exchange thermal energy among each other. You can also have kind of coupling between the power and the heat sectors. The district heating and cooling networks, but also the heat pumps, can then support the electricity grids. But be aware, this is only possible when you have a smart integrator somehow. And this again has a footprint as well. So I want to introduce circularity also in this energy context. If we would just use the locally available clean resources that are available, that are now typically dumped into the air, then we could do much more with less resources. And then a very nice side effect would be that the air is no longer the thermal waste bin. So that is kind of circularity approach we apply then to energy. But for this, we need, as I said, a system integrator. And for this, we have studied model predictive control, which is a controller that uses predictions to anticipate. And for this, the controller needs a model of the system. So there, the building modeling pops up. We need a good model that knows the dynamic behavior of the building with its energy system. We also need to do predictions, kind of forecasts of all disturbances, and which are typically the building occupants, and also the weather forecast is needed. We know the constraints of the building because what we want to do is creating a comfortable indoor climate. And then we use an algorithm that automatically optimizes an objective, and that gives then the optimal control input for the system, which is here presented as a building, where then also quite some sensors are available, and these measurement data feed back to the controller. So the control has a feed forward and a feedback action, and this is working very well because as such, we can exploit all flexibility which is present in the system. And I just give you a few examples. On the building level, we implemented this and we demonstrated this in real life. And we could, by using that MPC, we could save up to 55% just by using the flexibility in the system. For thermal networks, we also applied this methodology, this type of control. We compared it with rule-based control, but this is a simulation-based exercise, still need to be implemented in practice. And again, you see, you get better or equivalent thermal comfort, but you save energy. And here you can see clearly on the right-hand side, it's a plot for winter period and a spring period that in both cases, what the MPC does is reducing, MPC is the green line, it reduces the temperature you feed into the district heating system. Not because we reduce heat losses in the pipes, but because the centralized heat pump has a much higher COP at these low temperatures. And if you see a bit more in detail, you can also observe that the heat pump will be on earlier in the morning. So you shift the load, you use the flexibility in the system to come up with a lot of savings. Okay, I have to end. Okay, I had another example applied to the system level, but okay, I have to skip this one then. But what I wanted to show here is that we can also, by acting on the demand side, we can make solutions on the supply side. We can make baseload power plants operate fully continuously. We can limit the peak power plants, and we can use more renewable energy sources. So flexibility is becoming an asset, which has a lot of good benefits, flexibility for the renewable energy systems, decarbonization, a reduced dependency on fossil fuels, and a total cost reduction. So thanks to the system integration, we can go much beyond efficiency. We can create climate neutrality, energy security, resiliency, equity, affordability, and this all to create a healthy and a comfortable environment. And that's all captured in the concept of sustainability. These were my key takeaways. Still allowed to read them? Okay. So buildings and their HVAC have an active role to play in the global energy system. Efficiency and decarbonization go hand in hand. They do not counteract. Concept designs should aim for grid-friendly buildings and circular approaches. Thermal grids and heat pumps can support electrical grids. The temperature levels of heat supply and heat demand, they should be matched. Smart solutions do not count on AI only, but they also use locally available clean energy sources, and hybridization of technologies and approaches is key to capture a wider system benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieve. You did a great job getting through all the content in the time that was allotted. Thank you. Up next, we've got Brian. Lieve gave us a background of some of the theory, some of the philosophy, and some of the potential Brian has been working on a program here in California called Tech. It reminds me a lot of the early days of distributed generation, where California was leading and recognizing that we needed to keep track of this stuff. How many rooftops have PV? How many how big are they? What's the orientation? They're doing very similar things on building electrification, and I think we're going to look back on that as a kind of best practice. So without further ado, Brian, take it away.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for being here today. It's a little intimidating to be in front of this many electrical engineers as a buildings person, as Sean mentioned. Prior to being in buildings, I spent 10 years as a professional astrophysicist. I still think this might be the nerdiest room I've ever been in front of, so congratulations. I'm happy to be here. I can't really tell you much about grid infrastructure, but I can tell you about the demand side, which is where I work. And I can tell you a little bit about in the real world impacts that we're seeing for electrification measures. Lieve has set me up really well to talk about what we're seeing in the tech program in California. I want to talk a little bit today about how to measure and put a value on electrification impacts measured at the meters, plural, because we need to measure both the electricity and the gas meter when we're doing electrification projects. Talk about early results, first-year results from the Tech Clean California program, which is California's flagship electrification program, talking about both measured impacts on electricity and gas consumption, and also how we can learn from that to target customers appropriately to give us the best impacts on the grid and equity outcomes for electrification in the near term. And then talk a little bit about unlocking those electrified loads as a grid resource. I'll talk a little bit about the approach we take at Recurve, which is the markets that we run called flex markets, and give you some results from this year from one of those markets. So first, a little primer on how we do this measurement of electrification impacts at the meter. We use an open source software toolkit called FlexMeter, developed at Recurve. It starts with the Open EE meter, which was originally developed for EE, energy efficiency projects. Open EE meter generates counterfactual energy consumption by fitting a time of week and temperature regression model to the year prior to any demand side intervention. An intervention might be putting in insulation, installing a better air conditioner, or electrifying. And then after the intervention has occurred, we can forecast what the energy use would have been under that counterfactual in the absence of the intervention, and measure the difference between that and the actual observed consumption to get the savings or the load impact. I will talk a lot today about savings, even though I am talking about electrification. So positive savings means negative grid impacts, and negative savings means positive grid impacts. So you might have to stand on your head at some point to understand some of these charts. But that's just based on the energy efficiency background of what we do. However, when you're fitting a counterfactual to the year before, you're not accounting for long-term exogenous effects that also occur. For example, in California and in the US, we're in the middle of a major transition of lighting from incandescent and CFL to LEDs. That's going to impact on a population level, that's going to impact energy consumption over time. We need to account for that. Or things might happen like a global pandemic. In March of 2020, if you were running a measured energy efficiency program, your counterfactuals just all went out the window because everybody totally changed their behavior. The way we can account for that is through a software package called GridMeter, which constructs comparison groups for customers who have participated in demand-side programs and allows us to adjust or correct for population-level exogenous effects that might be driving people's energy consumption in order to back those out of the measurement. Once we've done those corrected measurements, we then have a tool called Flex Value that allows us to compute the dollar value of those energy savings by the hour in which they occurred for electricity. And for this, we rely in California on a tool called the Avoided Cost Calculator, developed for the CPUC by our friends over at E3, one of whom is on the stage with me today, which actually forecasts the hourly value of marginal changes in energy consumption to the grid, energy costs, capacity costs, infrastructure, T&D infrastructure costs, and GHG value. And so Flex Value allows us to actually say, here's what we measured that this intervention achieved, here's what it was worth. So we'll talk a little bit about this in the context of Tech Clean California. Tech Clean California is California's flagship heat pump market transformation initiative for space and water heating. The goal is to put 6 million heat pumps in homes in California by 2030. 50% of that funding goes to low-income households or disadvantaged communities. in an effort to make this approach more equitable generally, has guiding principles of scale, equity, regulatory simplicity, and market transformation. So there's focus both on installing things in homes and also doing training for the workforce in order to get contractors used to this new technology that they need to be putting into homes. And Recurve serves as the embedded measurement and verification contractor for that program, measuring in near real time what's happening when we put these heat pumps into people's homes, which will allow us to inform the decarbonization framework over the long term, chart a better course correct more quickly, and understand what's going on and make better decisions as we decarbonize buildings. So to give a quick overview, we've just finished the year one results from the tech program. We've seen significant net total system benefit in dollars and also net climate impacts from these projects. The net benefit to the grid, well, the power system, both on the electricity and the gas side, $3,750 per HVAC project over the lifetime of the project, and about $1,700 per heat pump water heater project, about 11 tons of avoided GHGs per heat pump project, and about 6 tons of avoided GHGs per heat pump water heater project. Again, over the lifetime of those projects is what we're able to measure for these. You can see this in more detail in the table at the bottom. Annual megawatt hour savings are negative and large. We have big increases in energy consumption, but these are offset by large reductions in annual gas consumption that also have a large value. I also want to note, and we'll look at this more at the next slide, that the peak electricity savings for space heating are positive, meaning that load during peak hours, 4 to 9 p.m. during the summer, went down when we put heat pumps into people's homes. For heat pump water heaters, it went up a little bit, but those are relatively small, and they're going to be offset by the gas impacts. So to get into more detail, this plot shows the average impacts in terms of gas and electricity for space heating electrification projects, putting in heat pump space heaters. We'll start over on the right and see the gas impacts. We have monthly gas billing data for this, so we only have monthly impacts, but you can see large reductions in gas consumption in the winter months and the spring and fall months, which is what you would expect if you take out people's furnaces and replace them with heat pumps. And on the right, we see the electricity impacts. These are average daily load shape impacts per season. So we have winter, shoulder, and summer plots here. And on the top row of plots, the dashed lines are the counterfactual that comes out of the open EE meter and grid meter modeling. And the solid lines are what is actually observed at the meter. And you can see kind of what you expect. The bottom row is, again, the savings shape. So negative numbers mean that the load went up. This is where you have to stand on your head. We see that in the winter, there's an increase in load across all hours of the day. Big morning peak as people heat their homes in the morning. Smaller evening peak as people heat their homes in the evening. This is this temporal mismatch that Lieve was just talking about. Winter mornings are not a great time to be relying on solar to deliver your electricity. In the shoulder months, we just see the morning impact primarily because it's relatively warm the rest of the day in California. And then what's really interesting is that in the summer, peak period load actually went down. And this is a question that we get a lot when we talk about electrification. What about the induced cooling load? You're giving people heat pumps, therefore you're giving them air conditioners. You're going to make your peak issue worse. Well, maybe. We're also giving people who have air conditioners that maybe were installed in 1995 a new air conditioner. We're probably also sealing up their ducts. We might be insulating their building. Their loads are going to go down. And we see that on net, peak loads come down a little bit, at least in the first year of tech. We can dig into that a little bit more. We can take all these customers and we can break them up into quartiles of pre-intervention cooling load. We run the open EE meter. One of the outputs of that is the customer's estimated annual cooling energy consumption in the year before they got the heat pump. We break that into quartiles of pre-intervention cooling consumption and plot the customer's savings shape after they got the heat pump in the summer. The average daily summer savings shape. That top quartile in black has huge savings during the cooling hours. They had really inefficient air conditioners and they got a better one. And so they're saving a whole lot of energy. Everybody else, the impacts are pretty small. That second quartile in blue, it's basically neutral. They had an air conditioner, they got a new air conditioner, no harm, no foul. The lower two quartiles are people who probably got new air conditioners. They use them a little bit, but most of them live where I live in Berkeley and on the coast in California. They don't need that much air conditioning, so it doesn't make that big a difference to the total peak load that occurs. And so on net, this top quartile of coolers is winning out. They're saving about half a megawatt hour per year during the summer peak hours only in electricity consumption for each of those projects. It gets even better. We can take that top quartile and split it in half. Now we have the top 2 octiles, I guess it would be, of pre-intervention cooling. That top 1/8 of customers saved more than 750 kilowatt hours during the summer peak. They provided about $2,500 in life cycle grid value for their electricity impacts alone. Despite the fact that they increased their consumption in the winter, these peak load reductions more than offset that, and they had a net positive impact on grid value for electricity alone, virtually 0 greenhouse gas impact from their electricity because they're reducing during the summer and increasing during the winter, which means that all of that gas benefit, both in terms of dollars and GHGs, is positive. It's not offset by anything. So they get all of that gas benefit. And these are the customers who are most likely to experience significant positive benefits on their energy bill. They're likely to save money overall on their energy bill, right? There's this issue that we saw in the last presentation of electricity is more expensive than gas, and so your overall energy bill might go up if you install a heat pump. These customers are probably the customers who are most likely to actually see their bills go down because they get a better air conditioner out of the deal. And there are over 1.5 million residential customers in California that meet this profile. So if we want to figure out where to start with electrification, this seems like a pretty good place. And to be clear, everyone should have and does have access to the incentives that tech provides, because if you want to electrify and get a heat pump and have nicer, more pleasant heat and help the environment, you should have access to those. But we really shouldn't be going and like banging down the doors of the people in those lower 2 quartiles who are going to increase their load and probably also see their bills go up. Right? Give that some time, try to figure out the best way to electrify those folks. Let the costs come down as we scale this technology, and everyone will be better off. So it's not all challenges, but certainly there are challenges to electrification. As we move out toward 2030, 2040, 2050, we're going to start to see a winter peak in California, which we don't have right now. California may turn into a dual peaking system or even a winter peaking system, which is not something we're really prepared for. And winter mornings are not a great time to be relying on solar. So we need to figure out how to solve for that. And one way to do it is to figure out what it's worth to not use electricity during the times when you're challenged and pay people what they're worth for flexing their load out of that, out of those periods. The way we do this at Recurve is we run programs called flex markets. These are open pay-for-performance marketplaces where aggregators, that is people who put projects into homes or commercial buildings, can receive incentive payments for flexing their energy at the meter. We use that hourly value stream from the avoided cost calculator to say what they're worth. And then we measure what actually occurs, and we pay people the value that they actually deliver to the grid. And it turns out if you tell people that the most valuable time to save energy is 4 to 9 p.m., and they are savvy aggregators who know how to put in a good energy efficiency project, if you put all the money on the table you want people to go to, they're going to go to that table, and they're going to get that money. And so it actually works very well in terms of reducing peak loads specifically and making sure that we're actually getting the most value out of our energy efficiency projects. Just to show an example of that and about how electrification can serve as a flexible resource for the grid. One of the programs we run is called Peak Flex Market. It's an MCE service territory. MCE is a community choice aggregator up in Northern California. The Peak Flex Market is a peak reduction program. We incentivize people to reduce their load during the 4 to 9 p.m. and especially the 7 to 9 p.m. hours in the summer, and incentivize them to move those loads out of the peak into the off-peak hours. And what we're seeing here is results from this year, this summer in Peak Flex. At the top is EV charging loads. Again, this is a savings plot, so positive numbers are reductions in load and negative numbers are increases in load. And we can see a big reduction in load during those peak hours, and it all gets shifted into the overnight and morning hours. On the bottom is the impacts of smart thermostats. They reduce load across all hours of the day because they're doing a better job of managing your set point based on when you're home. But if you incentivize people appropriately, they'll save more during those peak hours. And I mean, that's cooling. That's not the problem we're talking about with heat pumps. But if we're pairing the heat pumps with smart thermostats and getting people used to here's how you can save money and get paid by shifting your load out of the peak hours. Then as those winter morning hours start to be a problem, there's a natural way of addressing that with flexibility first, which is probably the least expensive thing to do. So to summarize, electrification of space and water heating is happening, starting to scale up in California. This is going to create some significant challenges, both for customers and the grid, and figuring out how to do this in the most beneficial, least troublesome way. By measuring the impacts at the meter now, we can understand what's happening in the real world and start planning for it in detail and setting a better course. Targeting customers, there are customers out there right now who are going to be better off and also help with the problems we're having right now if we can get them electrified. And so that's really where we should start. And if we can give people the right incentives, we can mitigate the problems that we face going forward ahead of time. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Brian. Next up, we've got Erik Delarue, also from Belgium. Erik's emphasis is a little different than Lieve's. He's going to walk us through a variety of examples of some research they've done, particularly trying to kind of evaluate impact on the future grid system. Take it away, Erik.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. So good morning also from my side. Erik Delarue from the University of Leuven in Belgium. My talk will be on the impact of building electrification on the electricity system of the future. So just a brief overview of the talk. First, quickly reflecting on building electrification. What are we talking about? Then looking at the impact it could have on the distribution grid already today, as we see, for instance, in some European countries. Also discuss the impact on the higher system level. Think of these interactions and how we could valorize the flexibility that might be present at these buildings. Then also show some examples of how we can model these interactions and then end with some conclusions. First, building electrification. It's a means to increase energy efficiency and hence also to move away from fossil fuels, so to decarbonize. And what are the elements that we could think of, also relating to what has already been said? It can be local generation, think of solar PV. It can be local storage, think of people investing in a home battery or having an EV with also vehicle to grid. And it can also be demand that could to some extent be flexible. And think of the heat pumps that have been talked about before, where we could use the thermal inertia of the building to have this flexibility. Think of water tanks that can be used. Think of electric vehicles where we could optimize the charging or other smart devices. This is a schematic of, let's say, the electricity system and also the corresponding markets, but maybe from a bit of a European perspective. So the solid lines are, you could say, the physical wires connecting the different actors, whereas the dashed lines or more contractual arrangements that we have. And we have the buildings at the very bottom of this figure that we now will electrify. We will have generation and additional load at that building level. So first, this building is connected to the distribution grid. So we might have implications there, and I'll immediately go into that. And then we also have implications on the system level, where we could affect, for instance, the system operator or affect the assets that are connected over there. But first, the distribution grid. And this is an example. It's not Belgium, it's the Netherlands, one of our neighboring countries. And this is the situation as it effectively is already today. So this is not a projection into the future. This is what it looks like today. So you see that already now there is a vast amount of regions in the Netherlands where it is just not possible anymore to have a certain new connection. And it's both for offtake on the left-hand side as well as injection on the right-hand side. So that is already the impact that we face today of this increased electrification, PV that has come to the grid, but also increased demand. Think of the uptake of EVs, for instance, that has contributed to this. This is then Flanders, so that is part of Belgium, where the situation currently is not as critical as in the Netherlands. So the situation today is depicted on the left-hand side. So it's light color, meaning not too many congestion issues. But then again, if we make a projection towards 2035, then you see what the grid would or the congestion would look like in the grid if there's no additional investment. So that's the figure on the right-hand side. Maybe to add here is that in a country like Belgium, the peak situation is typically the winter evening peak. And here is then an uptake of EVs included that would then to some extent also simultaneously charge, creating these possible congestion. And that's why grid enforcements are needed. Now in Europe in 2019, we had the release of the so-called clean energy package with a number of provisions to support these distribution network investment plans. I'll not go into too much detail, but what is maybe relevant for this talk is the one that I indicated in bold on the slide, to have flexibility as an alternative or a complement to grid investments. What does that mean? So the distribution system operator, they can use regulatory tools to source flexibility at the distribution level. And there are different ways to do that. The first could be dynamic network tariffs, so having tariffs that are variable in space and or in time. We could have flexible connection agreements where the DSO could curtail part of the load or part of the injection. We could have actual flexibility markets with bids both for supply and demand that could be cleared. You could have negotiated bilateral contracts between the DSO and other actors. You could have cost-based mechanisms or simply obligations where a DSO would oblige to curtail, for instance, certain part of the load. Currently, most mature in Europe is the first two, but we also see in some countries that we have these flexibility markets already occurring and taking place. And then a last slide concerning the distribution grid impact is to highlight and to stress the investments that will be needed in the years to come. So what you see in blue is the historical annual investment cost for the distribution grid. And what you see in green is the annual average that will be needed in the current decade, which is substantially higher than what we had before. So that's the distribution grid. And then, of course, this building electrification also has implications towards the higher system, what we call the system level impact, because the residual demand, the demand after subtraction of renewables or injection profiles, that obviously will change, will be different as perceived on the transmission level. I think if you have massive uptake of the heat pumps, as mentioned before, or electric vehicles with certain charging patterns, that will affect the profiles as seen on the transmission level. So it will affect the optimal mix that you could expect there, or the profitability of existing assets that are currently there. But at the same time, this electrification at the lowest level could also offer flexibility towards that system level. And that could take place on different timescales. It could be on the long term. If you have a capacity mechanism, you could contribute to adequacy. It could be on the short term, doing arbitrage. It could even be close to real time to help balancing the system. I'll give some examples of that later on. Now, how could these interactions take place and how could this flexibility be valorized? So here I make a distinction. First, as a consumer, you could directly yourself respond. If you have, for instance, in Belgium, you can engage in a dynamic electricity contract so that you are exposed to hourly electricity prices. So if you have such a contract, you could expect you as a consumer will respond to that. You could also be affected by the distribution tariff design. If you have, for instance, a capacity tariff that charges you based on the peak capacity, for instance, every month, it might affect your behavior. Or you could also be active in an energy community or in peer-to-peer trading. So these are actions that you as a consumer could take directly, responding to, for instance, these tariffs. Another way is to go via an intermediary or an aggregator that would source flexibility and then offer that to someone else. That could be, for instance, to the distribution system operator, as mentioned before, to help relieve congestion issues that we face at the distribution grid, for instance, through this flexibility market. But it could also be towards the TSO, the transmission system operator, that needs to source balancing capacity and energy. An aggregator could offer those services to the TSO, or towards adequacy. If you have a capacity mechanism in place, then often it's also open for demand response actions. Or it could be towards a balance responsible party, a market actor that could use those resources to optimize and to do market arbitrage or to help balancing its own position. And then this figure just to show some of the opportunities that might be there. So what the figure shows is for one random day that I took. So it's 24 hours, 96 quarters, because this is sort of a system where every quarter we have the imbalance of the system, and that is the system imbalance depicted by the orange bars, and then the corresponding imbalance price by the blue curve. What you see on the figure is that if the system is short, if the orange bars go below zero, that typically you would see a high or a positive imbalance price corresponding to that. But you also see that if the system is long, if the system imbalance is positive, if there is too much generation, that the corresponding imbalance price and the blue curve is typically pretty low and can become negative, meaning you would being paid to consume electricity. And it's just to show the high volatility of this imbalance price or of this sort of real-time market as we have it. The price heavily fluctuates, positive, negative values. So if you're able with your assets to forecast this, there is kind of an opportunity here to make revenue out of that and even help the system. Now I would like to connect this to some modeling, implications towards modeling and some exercises we did. We have a portfolio of various modeling tools ranging from the classic single objective optimization models to more economically inspired models, equilibrium models, where you model different actors, each having their own objective function and constraints, and where you seek for an equilibrium. I'll just give some examples of that. So a first example relates to the impact of building electrification, let's say, on the overall energy system, and it comes from the same study as the one that Lieve also had a figure from. So what we see here is sort of the demand side. We have on the left the residential demand being the demand for heating as well as electric appliances, situation in 2020 up to 2050, where you see the electrification taking place and along with that increase in energy efficiency. On the right, you see transport, these days still vastly dominated by fossil fuels, oil, but also here electrification taking place towards 2050, and with that strong increase in energy efficiency. So it means we will need more electricity. So if demand goes up, then obviously also the supply should correspond to that. So what you see here from the same study is how the installed capacity on the left and the electricity generation, the terawatt hours on the right, are being influenced. So we see a vast uptake of renewable energy, wind, both onshore, offshore, and massive deployment of solar PV, with then the generation on the right-hand side that corresponds to that. So that's a first example of how this building electrification, increased demand for electricity, the shift that we get, how that has implications on the system level. Then a second example is this kind of equilibrium modeling approach, where we want to assess how different distribution grid tariffs can affect the overall system, let's say. So And we also assess the impact of different price granularities that consumers perceive. So let me quickly walk you through what you've seen. I'll mostly focus on the results at the left bottom. So what you see is the three main figures. That's for three different distribution tariffs. So the first block is for a fixed tariff. Second is for a volumetric tariff. And the third one is for a capacity tariff. And then all the different bars in one of the three correspond to different sort of contracts that consumers have, different price granularities. So the first block each time is where consumers see hourly prices up to, if it is indicated by M12, it means that consumers just see one flat yearly price. And what you see in the results is basically how the total system composition, how the equilibrium state of that changes dependent on the tariff type that you have in place, as well as the resolution of the price that they perceive. And what you see is that the distribution grid tariff, in this case, has a much bigger impact. The difference between the three different graphs is much higher than the difference between the different pricing resolutions. What you also see is that if you have a volumetric or a capacity grid tariff in place, that is a strong driver for consumers to deploy solar PV, depicted in orange, as well as residential battery storage, which is the blue part in the curves. Then a third example, and that relates to this imbalance price that I showed before. Here we look at if you have a certain storage device, how you could engage in that market. So how you could, with your asset, take out of balance positions to expose yourself to that price to make a profit. What you see on the graph, the dashed line is the imbalance price, whereas the blue line and the green line, the solid lines, depict the state of charge of our storage asset with two different look-ahead horizons. So it's also kind of a model predictive control algorithm that we've put in place. And where this look-ahead is 40 quarter hours, you're better prepared to sort of take advantage of moments where this imbalance price would go negative, because that for you is the ideal moment to charge your battery because you are even being paid to do so. And with the algorithm that we developed, trying to forecast the system imbalance and the corresponding prices, we are able to even do better than just using your asset on the wholesale market with perfect price information, just by taking advantage of this really volatile prices as we see them in our balancing markets. And then a final example, because I see I'm running out of time. It's a bit of a different strand. It's trying to sort of get insight in what is driving consumers to adopt, to invest in solar PV. And what you see on the graph is basically the uptake, the number of installations of PV in Flanders, so in part of Belgium. So the black line is basically the number of new installations, whereas the dashed line is the cumulative of that. And what you see, it's also indicated by the red lines. Those are moments of changes in the support policies, because we had this system of green certificates in place. And you see that each time this policy changes, if the minimum prices that you got for these green certificates are being reduced downwards, that led to massive uptake because people still wanted to invest in PV right before the subsidy system changed. That's these different peaks that you see. In this exercise, we have a very rich data set that gives us information on the uptake of PV on municipality level, monthly data. We try to assess what is driving this uptake. We especially look at the future financial benefits, partly coming from these subsidy schemes, but also partly coming from just avoided future electricity cost, but also taking into account heterogeneity in buildings, in consumers, and things like that. And in this econometric analysis, we found that direct compensations, either via volumetric or just, let's say, tax credits based on the size of the installation, are more effective than future savings on your electricity bill as an incentive for consumers. I'll skip this example and then just wrap up. So building electrification has impacts already today on the distribution grid, and then as well as on the system level. But there is, of course, also flexibility that could be deployed to mitigate this impact. Interactions could take place directly, you as a consumer responding to signals, pricing signals, or could go via an intermediary. And then I presented some modeling examples, some system-wide optimization model outcomes, equilibrium model, and with the imbalance markets, that was a data-driven approach. Looking into the future, as far as modeling exercises are concerned, what we invest more these days is to also capture this consumer behavior, because often in optimization models, you would use pure rational economic optimizers as decision makers, but we know that consumers are not like that. And that's, with this last example, I wanted to show that there could be other factors at play that we now also try to capture in our models. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. We've got Ari Gold-Parker with E3 up next. Ari is not your typical E3 guy in the e-cig context, but I think that's good. I think he's got E3 is a big organization. They've got a lot of fun things to share. So Ari, I will let you take it away.
Well, first I want to say thanks so much to all these other great panelists. It's been really interesting to see all these presentations so far. My name's Ari Gold-Parker. I'm an associate director at E3, Energy and Environmental Economics. We're a San Francisco-based energy consulting company. And I'll be talking today about a slightly different approach to building electrification based on a research project we've been leading that's funded by the California Energy Commission. And so what we're looking at is targeting building electrification at specific areas where we know that there's going to be a near-term need for a gas system infrastructure project. So a gas main and service replacement project. And so we're calling this approach targeted electrification and gas decommissioning. The key question for this research project is how can this approach provide emissions reductions and cost savings while promoting equity and meeting the needs of local communities. And we've put together a great project team working on this. So our project partners are GridWorks, who's a California-based convening and stakeholder engagement organization. East Bay Community Energy, EBCE is the community choice aggregator or nonprofit electricity retailer in the East Bay region of the San Francisco Bay Area. And Environmental Justice Solutions, EJ Solutions, has been leading focus groups in some of these pilot communities for us. And then we're working really closely with PG&E, who's our project partner, and they've been sharing a lot of really important data on the gas system and helping us kind of understand and dig through this data. We did just release an interim report on this project, and so that's available on GridWorks website. So the first part of this presentation, all that's published, and you can find that online. And then we're working on publishing the benefit cost analysis framework that I'll share afterward. So some of the objectives of this project, and the ones in green will be the focus of the presentation today. The first is to develop a framework for identifying sites for targeted building electrification and gas decommissioning. So what does a good candidate look like for this approach? Using that framework, we're identifying proposed pilot sites. We've been engaging with local communities to understand their perspectives and priorities regarding this approach. EBCE is leading the development of deployment plans that are basically blueprints. If the funding were available, how would you actually go about implementing these projects? And then finally, we've been developing a benefit cost analysis framework to understand what are all the benefits and what are all the costs of this approach from different perspectives. So just want to provide a little bit of background and context. There's some interesting prior work that we've actually been doing also in partnership with the Energy Commission in California. So first, this 2018 study, Deep Decarbonization and a High Renewables Future, that basically established that in California, building electrification is likely to be the least cost option for decarbonizing the large majority of our residential and commercial buildings. And that's partly because of our summer peaking grid, which means the system impacts from building electrification are fairly limited. And also, of course, because of our mild climates and relatively small needs for peak space heating demands. And then in 2020, we published this work called The Challenge of Retail Gas in California's Low Carbon Future. And what this study demonstrated is that in a future with really widespread building electrification, folks departing from the gas system are going to create real cost challenges for cost recovery for gas distribution utilities, because they're going to have to recover the costs for all the infrastructure from a declining customer base and from dramatically declining throughput. And so that could lead to very significant increases in gas rates for remaining customers, who may predominantly be low-income customers and renters who can't afford the building electrification upgrades or who don't have a choice over the equipment in their homes. And so in the present day, there's a lot of different open kind of proceedings and research projects that are looking at questions around how can we plan the gas system in a way that reflects our kind of growing move toward electrification for serving a lot of these end uses in buildings, and how can we think about hopefully mitigating some of these cost challenges on the gas system in the long term. So first, want to share the site selection framework that we've developed. And so this proposed framework is a 3-step framework. So we started with kind of our full research area, which is the combined EBCE and PG&E service territory. So this is 11 municipalities in the East Bay, plus all of unincorporated Alameda County in the East Bay. And we applied our first step, which is our candidate screen. We did this using PG&E's gas asset analysis tool, which is a really interesting GIS-based planning tool. They've basically taken a lot of the key data and key kind of analytical information out of their physical hydraulic gas flow models and put it all into a single, like very fast and easy to use GIS-based tool for their whole distribution system. And so we were able to use this to screen for a number of important characteristics. So first, we're looking for hydraulic feasibility. Do we think if we remove the gas infrastructure in a given location that might strand customers downstream without access to gas? If so, then those sites would be screened out. We're also looking at sites that have a high DIMP score. So this is PG&E's Distribution Infrastructure or Integrity Management Program. And so it's basically their risk model. Where is the infrastructure most at risk, as that's going to drive near-term capital investment decisions? And then finally, we actually excluded pipeline segments that need to be replaced immediately, because we know it's going to take some time to implement these kinds of projects, and we want to make sure we have the lead time to actually ideally achieve one of these projects through full electrification of the site. So that got us to some candidate sites. Our next step is a detailed engineering review. So here, PG&E actually used their hydraulic model to confirm the hydraulic feasibility of these sites and to make sure that you actually could decommission the gas infrastructure without causing reliability challenges for remaining customers. And then the final step is site prioritization. And there's a number of different criteria you could use to prioritize sites. And the weighting of those criteria might vary depending on case. So because this is a research project, we're interested in learning about different kinds of buildings, different kinds of neighborhoods. But another prioritization approach could rely more heavily on cost effectiveness or on equity considerations. So there's a lot of different criteria that could be used for prioritization. And so this is showing the 11 candidate sites that came out of this screening process, as well as in yellow, the 3 ultimate sites that are going to be prioritized for development of the deployment plans. These sites have anywhere from 80 to about 250 customers. And then the table on the right is showing some important characteristics of the customer base and the building stock, including the share of multifamily customers, the share of customers enrolled in the CARE low-income bill discount program. folks who already have electricity for space or water heating end uses, air conditioning adoption, age of the building stock, as well as the amount of commercial square footage in each of these sites. And all of these we found are important factors that might influence the cost effectiveness and the implementation feasibility for these projects. So moving now into our benefit cost analysis results. These are draft. We've just gotten some great feedback on these draft results from our technical advisory committee. So we'll be kind of revising these materials and hopefully publishing this in the next few weeks. So actually, I want to start by saying we've looked at cost effectiveness from a number of different perspectives, including the participant perspective, the gas ratepayer perspective, the electric ratepayer perspective, the total resource cost perspective, and the societal cost perspective. And I'm going to focus here on the total resource cost perspective. So this is looking at all benefits and costs to electric and gas ratepayers of the investor-owned utilities. And so here we're including both participants and non-participants, but importantly, we're only including benefits that are monetized in the existing regulatory framework. So for a carbon price, we're using the regulatory cap and trade carbon price, which is much lower than what the social cost of carbon would be. And we're also not including things like outdoor air quality impacts that, although they're important and might have actual human health costs, are not currently monetized. So starting with the costs of implementing these projects, the text here is a little small, so I can walk through these. The first big bar is just the upfront cost of all the behind the meter electric equipment for these customers. And we're finding that before incentives, this is about $19,000 per customer, and that's to electrify space heating, water heating, cooking, and clothes drying for customers who have clothes dryers. In addition, we're looking at electric panel and service upgrade costs of about $3,500 per customer. And I'll come back to this on another slide. We also have final line transformer costs on the distribution system of about $1,000 per customer on average. And so we're looking here across 11 sites and across about 1,500 customers. Interestingly, we found no primary electric distribution costs upstream of the final line transformer. And then the last cost component here, we're calling the electric supply cost. And this is actually based on the avoided cost calculator that Brian had mentioned. And here it's basically a forecast of energy costs, transmission capacity, generation capacity to basically serve electricity for these electric end uses. So this gets us up between $20,000 and $25,000 in costs per customer. So now layering in the benefits. The first benefit here is the avoided cost of having to replace the gas equipment at the end of its life. So what we've done here is taken the like for like replacement costs for a gas furnace, gas water heater, gas stove, gas clothes dryer, and we've discounted them by about 10 years, assuming that folks wouldn't have to replace this equipment for 10 years, which is to say that it's about halfway through its useful life. The next benefit here are federal incentives, not only the IRA tax credit, but also the much more significant low-income rebates for folks who we expect would be eligible for those rebates. The next savings are for the avoided gas commodity, folks not having to purchase gas, and that's a benefit under the TRC. Net greenhouse gas savings are pretty small, only about $1,300, and that's life cycle over the kind of 20-year project term that we're looking at. Again, this number would be much higher if we were using a social cost of carbon, but we're using that much lower regulatory carbon price. And then finally, net avoided methane leakage. And what we see here is that even after kind of looking at all these benefits of a traditional electrification program, we still see net costs from building electrification. And this is something that regulators have been really grappling with in California. We know we need to achieve these very significant building electrification targets. But under our existing regulatory framework with a fairly low carbon price, these projects don't always look cost effective. And what's interesting then is in these candidate sites, we're able to leverage a very significant additional benefit. And so the next bar here is the avoided cost of replacing the gas mains and services. And this is about $4 million per mile in these project sites with an average of about 200 customers per mile. So it's a pretty significant benefit here. The first bar is the actual avoided CapEx, and then the second bar is other revenue requirement impacts, including utility income tax and accruals for removal costs on those investments. And so after including the avoided main and service replacement, we now see very significant net benefits under the TRC of about $12,000 per customer. I know this group's going to be really interested in distribution costs, so I want to talk a little bit about panel and service upgrade costs. A lot of folks in older buildings in California might only have a 100-amp panel and service. And so I think there's an interesting question around how much building electrification we could accommodate on those smaller panels and services, but our expectation is that a lot of these customers might need upgrades, and these upgrades really range in price very significantly. PG&E's told us the panel could be anywhere from $3,000 to $15,000, and the service upgrade could be anywhere from $10,000 all the way up to $60,000, where significant trenching is required. And importantly, there's very poor data on which customers actually need these upgrades and which upgrades are likely to be lower cost versus higher cost. So we've used kind of a simplifying assumption in our modeling that older homes who don't have air conditioning or electric resistance heat, that those folks are likely to need these upgrades, and that they're going to skew toward the lower cost of these ranges, although we have looked at sensitivities on the higher costs. But on average, this gets us to about $3,600 per customer across all the customers who need these upgrades and those who don't. And then looking at other distribution system costs, PG&E engineers evaluated in detail 3 out of the 11 candidate sites, and we've extrapolated those results to all 11. So what we found is about $1,000 per customer in final line transformer costs, and interestingly, no primary distribution system costs. And I think that's not entirely surprising. For one, these sites have about 150 customers, and so they're relatively small compared to primary distribution systems. But then importantly, even though specific portions of the distribution system might be winter peaking, the grid overall is very strongly summer peaking. And so that the higher up you get in the distribution system to these higher levels, it's going to increasingly look like the bulk grid and have that summer peaking characteristic. So just want to note that this result might be really closely tied to our summer peaking grid and our mild winters. One really key result here is that there are significant net costs to the participant. So that's the upfront capital costs minus all available incentives. So the available incentives, by no means pay the full upfront costs of these upgrades. What we found is that in many of these sites, the savings from avoiding gas main and service replacement are really significant and could actually cover that missing money to fund these electrification projects. So the avoided pipeline replacement savings are the green bars on the right. The solid yellow bar is the net CapEx. We're looking as well, if we were to also upgrade folks with electric resistance to heat pumps, how much would that add to the costs? And then finally, the gray bars are the panel and service upgrade costs. So we see in these 11 sites, A through K, the savings from avoided gas pipeline replacement are fairly significant relative to these costs. And some of those funds could potentially be used to actually fund the associated building electrification projects. But do want to note clearly that if we were to use those funds in that way, that would reduce the amount of these savings that would accrue to gas ratepayers, and that would ultimately be available to help mitigate long-term gas cost pressures. So there really is this trade-off in the near term. On one hand, there's this missing money to actually implement these projects, and we have this pool of savings that could potentially be repurposed to fund these projects. But if we do that, then we're missing out on the ability to actually provide long-term cost savings for gas customers. And then one final finding here is that this approach is going to look much more cost-effective in less dense areas. And what this cartoon is showing is that if you have 2 different communities with the same length of pipeline, but one has more customers and one has fewer customers, we're going to see different overall cost effectiveness. And that's because the costs scale proportionally with the number of customers to electrify, whereas the savings scale with the mileage of avoided main and service replacement. And so this is a pretty interesting finding, and it might actually steer the prioritization of these projects toward less dense areas of the service territory. And interestingly, our candidate sites are very dense relative to PG&E's broader service territory. So what this tells us is that this approach even though it looks cost effective in these sites, it could be significantly more cost effective in less dense parts of the service territory where those avoided pipeline savings could go a lot further on a per customer basis. So with that said, just want to end with these key findings. The first is that in these specific locations where you could potentially avoid gas system investments, we found this to be a cost-effective strategy to implement building electrification while avoiding gas system investments. The savings from the avoided gas pipeline replacement could potentially be used to fund the building electrification projects. However, there's an important trade-off that would reduce the savings that accrue to gas ratepayers. Our modeling indicates that less dense sites will see better cost effectiveness. And then finally, this is really kind of an economic study, but there's a lot of feasibility challenges associated with these projects. So significant regulatory and policy changes would be needed, both reforms to planning, reconsideration of the utility obligation to serve. There's a lot of important policy changes that would be needed to actually implement these projects at any kind of a large scale. Thanks so much.